Hi everyone. So today's video is a review of solving equations with variables. Okay, and we are on video number 7. I believe it's page 26 in your packet. All right, so when we want to solve equations that have variables in it, our goal should always be to isolate the variable. Now in this case, we use x, but variables can be any letter we want them to be. All right, so to isolate the variable, we actually have to do the inverse operation to get numbers to the other side. So for example, 8 is being subtracted from x. So to get it to the other side, I have to add it. And whatever you do to one side, you have to balance on the other side. What's really nice about solving equations with variables is you can always check your answer. For example, I can write 25 minus 8 and ask myself, does that equal 17? And it sure does. So I know that I've done the equation right. All right, so they can get a little harder. They get a little harder when I throw other parts into it. So for example, in this equation, I have parentheses and I have negatives. Now from our earlier video on the distributive property, remember that this negative in front of the parentheses means I want the opposite of everything inside the parentheses. So I physically have to distribute that negative through to everything, making it 2 minus 3 minus y equals 6. All right. Then we always combine like terms on each side before we start balancing the equation. So 2 minus 3 gives me negative 1 minus y equals 6. All right, so now I'm going to get that 1 to the other side by doing the opposite, the inverse operation. So it's being subtracted, so I'm going to add it. But then I have this little problem happen. I have a negative y equals 7. Well, to get rid of that negative y, because we're solving for y, we're going to divide both sides by negative 1, which would make the y positive. Since you divide negative by negative, it makes it positive, and it would make the 7 negative. And so y is equal to negative 7. All right, again, I can put this through and check it if I want to. You can check by just plugging it in. So 2 minus 3 minus 7. Does that equal 6? Well, it becomes 2 minus 3 minus 7 is negative 4, and then I have a negative times a negative, which becomes a positive, and 2 plus 4 does equal 6. All right, example 3 is a little harder. Why? Because I put in fractions. All right, so I have a negative 2/3 x equals 8. Well, what you'd basically be doing, I don't want you to write this down, I just want you to watch for a second. You basically would be dividing by 2/3 on both sides. But remember from the video on operations of fractions and what you learned in the last couple years in fractions, when you divide fractions by fractions, you have to keep change flip. So what you're actually doing is 8 times and flipping the denominator, which would be negative 3/2. So one way to handle problems that have fractions in them with a variable only, there's nothing else except that number, that constant or that coefficient and the variable, is you can really just jump to the multiplying by the reciprocal. So I actually am going to multiply both sides by negative 3/2. So I'm jumping a step ahead. Why does that work? Well, think about it. The 3's would cancel. The 2's would cancel, and the negative would become positive. So I would have isolated the x. Then on this side, I have 8, I have over 1. And then remember, we simplify before we multiply. So I see that 2 goes into itself once and into 8 4 times. And then I do 4 times negative 3, which is negative 12. All right, so this is one way to isolate the variable when we have a fraction in front of it. All right. Sometimes we also have to do multiple steps to variables. So for example, if I'm solving for n, the first thing I would have to do would be to get the 9 to the opposite side. So I would have to add 9 to both sides. I don't want to divide by 5 first. I have to do, it's really like backwards PEMDAS to solve. Backwards PEMDAS, or GEMDAS, because you have to do the addition and subtraction first, then the multiplication and division, and from there we solve. So I add 9 first, I get 5n equals 80, and then I divide by 5 on both sides because 5's being multiplied to n. I have to do the inverse operation. So then n equals, what is that? 16, okay? N equals 16. All right, so those are some basic pre-algebra examples. It also gets harder when there's variables on both sides of the equation. Okay, so you've got to be really smart here. Before you start balancing the equation and bringing something from one side to the other, you're going to want to combine the like terms. So right here I have a 6m and a negative 7m, which gives me negative m. So I have 5 minus m equals 10m plus 3. All right. But what do? Do I bring the negative m to the one side or do I bring the 10 over? So my trick is I always tell kids, bring the smaller variable to the larger. So I'm going to bring this negative m, I'm going to add him to the other side. And then I'm also going to subtract 3 to isolate that variable to get the variable by itself. So I'm going to get 2 equals 11m. Now 11 is being multiplied to the m, so I have to do the inverse operation. So I'm going to divide both sides by 11. So m is equal to 2 over 11. Okay? All right, a little bit harder. I throw parentheses in. Example 2. So I first have to, again, I have to simplify each side using proper order of operations before I balance. So I'm first going to distribute my 3. Look at me using those arrows I told you about. So I get 3n minus 6 minus 1 equals, I have to distribute a negative 5 through. So I get 2 minus 5n minus 25. All right, now I combine like terms on both sides. So I can combine the 6 and the negative 6 and negative 1 and get negative 7. I can combine the 2 and the negative 25 and get negative 5n minus 23. All right, so now we're ready to isolate the variable. So we're going to bring the smaller variable, which is negative 5, to the larger by doing its opposite. So I'm going to add it to the other side. Notice I'm putting a line because I like to be really neat about these equations. Then I'm going to also add 7 to the other side. Okay. All right, so this gives me 8n equals negative 16. Negative 23 plus 7 is negative 16, right? These cancel and these cancel. All right, so now I divide both sides by 8 and I get n equals negative 2. All right, so that one was a little bit trickier. So this might be the one that you take a second, pause, and rewatch what I just showed you. So first we distributed, so there were no parentheses. Then we combined like terms on each side. Then we balance the equation by using the inverse operation and isolate that variable to solve for n. All right, last one. Oh my gosh, what are you doing, Coach Fred, to us? I'm using fractions. It's okay with fractions. We just want to make sure we distribute and multiply. So I'm going to multiply 1/3 and 1/3. So 1/3 times 2. 1/3 times 2 is 2/3. So I get 2/3 x. 1/3 times 6, I can simplify. 3 goes into itself once, 3 goes into 6 twice. So it actually becomes plus 2. All right, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to distribute, which means multiply. So I have 2/3 times 6. Now again, I'm going to simplify before I multiply. 3 goes into itself once and into 6 twice. So 2 times 2 gives me 4x. All right, and then I'm going to do 2/3 times negative 12. And I'm going to simplify again. 12 I'm going to put over 1. 3 goes into itself once, into 12 4 times. And then 2 times negative 4 gives me negative 8. All right. Now I'm going to isolate a little bit more. I'm going to subtract 2 to both sides. All right, so now I've got this yucky looking equation equals 4x minus 10. Now in the next video, I'm going to go into more detail, but this is not a place that you're allowed to multiply by the reciprocal. Why? Because I have this x over here. Now, yes, I could subtract it and get a common denominator, or I can use a technique that I hope many of you have learned. If not, the next video is going to show it to you. The technique is called, wait for it, clearing fractions. Clearing fractions is a way to simplify an equation so there's no more fractions in it. To clear fractions, all you do is you find the lowest common denominator, which in this case for all the terms would be 3. And then you multiply every term by that number. When you do that, look what happens. In the first term, the 3's will cancel and you'll get 2x. Then, because whatever you do to one side of the equation, you have to do to the other, you'd have to multiply 3 times 4, which would give me 12x. And then you also have to multiply 3 times 10, which is going to give me negative 30. All right, so now I have an equation without fractions. I cleared the fractions. All right, now I'm going to balance the equation. I'm going to bring the smaller variable to the larger, which is going to give me 0 equals 10x minus 30. I'm going to isolate the variable by bringing the 30 to the other side, and we get 30 equals 10x. All right, and then we're going to divide both sides by 10, and so x equals 3. All right, guys, hopefully that'll help you do the solving equations part on the next few pages. Again, be really careful with the fractions and note all the different ways that we're going to be doing them. Have a great day.